All right. We are starting a class in here in the book of Deuteronomy, as you can see. I know that a lot of times when a preacher starts a book, he says, "Well, this is my favorite book of the Bible." I'll just narrow it down and say, this is my favorite book of the Torah, of the first five. This is one of my favorites. I look at Deuteronomy, and you'll see this as we go through the book. We sing songs like, "I don't want to cross Jordan alone," and living this life as in preparation for crossing the Jordan. That's what this book is about. This book is about Moses, the prophet, who's been with the people of God for so long, so long, is now saying, be ready to cross the Jordan, and not only that, be ready to live the life that you're going to be living in the Promised Land. And very much so, the book of Deuteronomy mirrors a lot of things that are still very relevant for us today in living a life of obedience to God. Those are themes that we'll be kind of mentioning. We won't do a lot in by way of a critical introduction to this book, more of a thematic introduction. Deuteronomy is, as we said, the second giving of the law, and this comes from chapter 17, verse 8, or verse 17, verse 18. The Talmud, which is the Jewish collection of their their commentary, so to speak, the way that they interpret what we would consider the Old Testament, what they would consider the law and the prophet, the way they interpret it. But that book, they refer to it as the Mishnah Torah, or repetition of the Torah, the giving of the law. That's a series of lessons, possibly given in a short period of time, and it kind of covers a couple different things. One or two major things: the call of the younger generation to remember. When we stopped and we were finishing up the book of Numbers, we had two numberings in the book of Numbers. We had the first numbering of those rebellious people, right? Those grumblers. And then we had a second numbering. What was the second numbering? Yes, those that survived, right? Those that survived after those who were the younger than 20, so 19 and younger as far as men going to war. Those that survived, or there was a second numbering. And so this book addresses them, and you'll see some repetition. We learn by repetition, correct? And so in this situation, you will see the word remember, 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 remember. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, over and over again in this book, as he's trying to get them to grasp. You also see, read, where he says, you saw with your eyes these things. Don't forget it. And so that'll be a theme that repeats. Also to leading them into obedience. Their fathers, we're not as great at being obedient, right? And so he's trying to get them to be obedient for the love of God. And we'll see some of that tonight in the first 4 chapters we try to cover tonight. The book opens with these words. These are the words that which Moses spoke to all Israel, and then closes with this kind of eulogy. Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Think about that in comparison with Christ coming. And the relationship, obviously, there. These are the bookend comments about Moses with this book. And so, obviously, Moses plays these are the words, his exhortation to them that they remember. As I said before, there's a plea to not forget, to teach future generations, and to keep in practice what was taught to them. And so, this continuation idea of this has got to be continued. This needs to be passed down. We'll see that. Especially early on in the book, that urgency to continue for future generations not to forget. It's more, we can think of things as a society we don't want to forget, but these are things that are critical to their future as a people. This is not remembering the Alamo. This is not remembering 9/11. You can still exist as a nation. What he's saying is, if you forget these things and go away from them, you will not exist as a nation. And so that's an important thing he's trying to get them to understand. Here's a brief outline. If you wanted a brief outline of the book, This gives you an idea of breakdown. There's a lot of different ways we could break this down, but this is the most simplistic way of looking at it. I find that having a simple outline and going through this thematically will make it easier for us. Too complicated an outline is just that, complicated. So this breaks it down. But in general, there's a large section of the speech that Moses gives to the people. And it could be broken down maybe into several sections, but we're just going to say it's one whole speech. And it is Moses that wrote this. There are those who would say otherwise, but Jesus says Moses wrote it, so I'll stick with that. And Jesus even quotes the book of Deuteronomy when dealing with Satan in the desert, as though the Lord said these things. So I think I'll stick with Jesus' opinion on the authorship of this book. But anyway, here is just a brief outline for you to get an idea of kind of where we're going with this. So jumping into these first few chapters, is it going? Okay. We have this brief introduction, and right away we have this idea of authority. These are the words which Moses spoke. Now, if you were to go back and look at the book of Numbers and the introduction to the book of Numbers, it says, these are the words the Lord spoke to Moses. And I don't know, there's a lot to say about that, the difference here, other than that the people considered this kind of a message as well from Moses' heart, not just a here are the laws, here are the ordinances, here are the things, but they really felt like this was a message as well from Moses' heart. But we do see later on that verse 3 tells us this was given by commandment of God. It doesn't take away from the authority that was here, but it's interesting that this comment is what's done right away, different than the other books. We're also given location. Not all of these that we read here in these first few verses, we don't know where all of these are. We have a ballpark. If you want to look in the back of your Bibles, if you have paper, physical Bibles, or you can Google it, a map of these events that usually have these things kind of there as well, the wanderings of the Jews. A song, but anyway, we'll leave that alone. There was 3 wandering. There's a lot more than 3, but they were wandering. And so there'll be a map there, but we don't know all these locations. But this gives us a timestamp of where they are, as well as verses 3 and 4 kind of talk about this. In the 40th year of the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all the Lord had commanded him to give them. So this is him talking about everything that God had given them. And he says, after they had defeated Sihon and the king of the Amorites. And so this is after we finished the book of Numbers, and they had defeated these people already. And you remember Gad and Reuben and half the tribe of Manasseh were like, hey, we really like it here. Can we have this? Well, that's going to come up again. And he's kind of given us a little bit of a epilogue of things that happened earlier. So it's after those events that this book begins to be written. So they're on the other side of the Jordan, across from Jericho is kind of where they're camped at this point. And so we're given this information. We go into kind of this prologue into kind of the events that are taking place. And we are again reminded of some things. And so, verse 5, across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound the law, saying. This is a great kind of introduction to what? He's expounding on the law. That's why a second giving. This is why kind of a reminder, a fresher course on the law. Some other things are given here as well. But he said, the Lord our God, verse 6, spoke to us at Horeb. Whenever you see Horeb, you can kind of say Sinai as well. I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever read books where they're going through a lot of different locations, and you're like, I got to have a map while I read this book to be able to know what we're talking about. In this case, Horeb is the area, Sinai is a mountain specific. And so you can use those, and a lot of times they're used interchangeably. So Sinai, why is Sinai important? What happened at Sinai? What's that? That's where Moses went up that mountain, right, and came down with the Ten Commandments. That's where we have the giving of the law, and those things are going to be referenced here. So he's saying here, the Lord spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you've stayed too long and enough in this mountain, and turn and journey, and tells them to go into the hill country of the Amorites, and talks about that journey up to Kadesh. They go up to Kadesh, and on the way we see in verses 9, and then again in verse 16 of this section, where he talks about this breakdown of authority, where he says, verse 9, I am not able to bear the burden of you alone. This is why, parenting is done well is easier in pairs, right? And sometimes maybe more than that. I talk to parents whenever they go from 2 children to 3 children. You go from man-to-man defense to zone defense. When you get into 3 children, right? So what he's saying here, he says, I as one individual cannot bear you alone. And so we see that breaking up of authority here. This was something that his father-in-law Jethro told him, early on. And then God later on said, yeah, you need to do this. You need to break it up. And so he talks about that breaking down. And he chose wise and discerning, experienced men from your tribes and appointed them. And then he talks about in verse 16, then I charged your judges that time, saying, hear the cases between your fellow countrymen and judge righteously. Verse 17, you shall not show partiality in judgment. If we show partiality in any kind of judgment, what does that break down? What breaks down when a judge shows partiality in a case, or shows partiality in any way? What begins to break down? A trust. A trust that something's going to happen. It breaks down when God is saying, I want you to be a righteous nation. It breaks down, obviously, that's sin. It breaks down the righteousness of that judge. They're a judge in a way that God would judge as well. So that really tears down a foundational concept of that society, of that group. And so he says, you need to not judge in a partial manner. If you want to write out there, James chapter 2, verse 1, and that our God does not show partiality. James chapter 2, verse 1, and then also verse 9, that we should not show partiality in any kind of judgment or concerns in any matter. Anyway, so we have this kind of authority that was established in that time, and he reminds them of that time. Verse 19, we set out from Horeb, we went through the great terrible wilderness, and you saw the hill country, and we came to Kadesh Barnea. And we've come to, and he says, we've come to the hill country. See verse 21, see the Lord our God has placed the land before you. Go up, take possession of this land. The God of our fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Go attack them, right? It was what happened. Before they decided to do that, what military move did they decide to do before just rushing in headlong and attacking everybody? We want to spy out the land, right? We want to send in the spies, and they do that. And it's interesting how he retells this here. He says, then all of you approached me and said, let us send men before us. And he's like, that sounds like a great idea, and we did that. Now, they came back, and their commentary on the land was good. What does it say here happened? Look in this section here, verse 26. He says, or verse 25 says the report was great about the land. What happened in verse 26? What does he say? You were not willing. You were not willing. God has provided a lot for us, has he not? We need to make sure that we are willing to do what God is saying. I've already promised you this is what's going to happen. And sometimes in our lives, we're in a situation where we don't trust, or we think it's all on us. And God has always said, no, oh, no. I'm the one doing the thing. I just need you to be willing to step out and do it. And there are things in our lives, right, that we need to be willing to step out and do, but you are not willing. And God is saying, I do this thing for you. I help you with this thing. So they weren't willing. They rebelled. And it's interesting here, their perspective. They grumbled in their tents, and what did they say about God? He hates us. Have you ever heard children talk about oh, I have a teacher, but she just hates me. She always wants me to get right answers. She always wants me to study, and she just hates me. Or you hear about children complaining about their parents. My parents are getting on to me, they're correcting me, they're doing those things, they just hate me. They hate me. What is the perspective here? Their perspective is that God brought them out in this place to die. God hates us. What has He been showing them this whole time? That He loves them. That He loves them. Hebrews chapter 12 tells us that even reproof is love. Oh, you hate me. You're always telling me I'm doing wrong. You're always doing this. It's love. Right? It's tough love. Sometimes tough to hear, always tough to give. Right? And so in this situation, God is showing actually that He loves them. They are His chosen people. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but their perception is God hates us. I don't know if we ever get into situations where life is difficult. I've got to do right things. It's a challenge. I don't want this challenge, Lord. Why are you giving this to me? I love you. I trust you. I know you'll do this thing. Right? And so anyway, there's so many things we could look at. We don't have time to go through all this stuff, but God hates us. Our children are going to die, and we're just going to eat worms, right? So that's the kind of message here that they're saying in these verses. Then he says, don't be shocked or fear them. The Lord your God goes before you. He's going to fight. Verse 31, the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son. That's what God is saying He's doing for His people. I carried you as a man would carry his son through difficult times, through areas where he couldn't walk, right? The whole footsteps on the beach thing, that's this, right? God had it first. It was not, before it was a poem, it was Deuteronomy chapter 1, okay? So here is what he's giving to them. So this is a great image. God's image, His perspective of this scenario is a loving father carrying his son. They're saying, well, you just hate us. You see the difference there in perspective. But you did not trust the Lord your God. That's a big no-no, verse 32, who goes before you. And then you heard, verse 34, that He was angry and that no men were going to go over except Caleb, the son of his dad. He shall see it, and his sons in the land which he set foot, because he has followed the Lord fully. The Lord is angry with me also on your account. Look over in go back to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. Beginning of verse 29, when God is, pronouncing this upon them. Your corpses will fall in the wilderness, even all your numbered men, according to your complete number, from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. I like his dad's name better. But we look at, who did he leave out? Also, before I know it about so. Moses. He left out Moses. These are the only two. And this is prior to Moses' little incident. All right, this is prior to Moses' incident, the rock incident, right? And so Moses then knew he was not going to see this. And he says it here. The Lord is angry with me also on your account. And he kind of throws it on them, right? He's like, throws it at them. But anyway, saying you shall not enter. And so he talks about Joshua as well. So that's an interesting kind of parallel there. Some of these things, as he goes through, we get a little more information on these as we go through some of these events. And then he begins talking about the rebellion, and they tried to go and do it anyway, but they rebelled, they acted presumptuously in going and trying to take the city anyway, and they were chased like people that are chased by bees, and so they died. And they spent many days in Kadesh Barnea, chapter 1, as we end there. And then we get into chapter 2, and the wandering in the wilderness, and the circling of Mount Seir for many days, he says in verse 1. And then he talks about the different areas that they're going into. They go into an area of their brothers, right? And you'll pass through the territory of your brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, and they'll be afraid of you, so be very careful. Do not provoke them, for I will not give you any of their land, even as little as a footstep. If you were to just draw around your foot, I'm not even going to give you that much of their land. I'm not giving you any of their land. That's for them. That was their inheritance, the descendants of Esau. Go through there, pay your way through, pay for food, pay for the water, pay for usage, and go through and be careful. That's what he tells them in concerning Esau. He says there, concerning that, if they were concerned about paying for anything, he says, the Lord your God has been with you, you have not lacked anything, verse 7. And so they went through that area of the Esau. And then he talks about, the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, verse 9, or provoke them in their travels, for I will not give you any of their possession, because that is the sons of Lot as a possession. And this is where we get into the interesting kind of talking about previous peoples, or other people that were living in these areas before. He said the Emim, I guess would be a better enunciation, the Emim lived there formerly, a people as great, numerous, and tall as Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. Emim means terrible, the terrible people. And so there were these fearsome peoples that lived in these areas. Some of them were ousted by Esau, others by other people. But there are these terrible, and we'll talk more about them later on when we get into talking about some of their other history. So the Lord gave that to them. Esau disposed these people, some of these people, and the Lord helped them in that disposal, getting rid of them. And in verse 14, it says, the time that it took for us to come from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the brook of Zered was 38 years. So all this wandering around from the leaving of that place to they're coming back over the brook, going back north, was 38 years in the wandering. And the men from within the camp had perished, all those men that were numbered. If you want to write out here, Numbers chapter 26, verses 64 and 65, this correlates with that as well. Numbers 26, 64 and 65. Verse 15, and the hand of the Lord was against them, those that were in the camp. So as they're traveling, we have situations we saw in the book of Numbers where there were large amounts of people dying at the same time, right? 250,000 people or 250 people, men dying, and just people drowned, swallowing them up in the rebellion of Korah, and those kind of things. But also, the text tells us that the hand of the Lord was against them. So whatever ill will they, axe head slipped off and hit somebody that needed to die. You see what I'm saying? Like the will of God was against these people. So them being in that camp, if it was dangerous, they were probably going to die from it, because God said you're going to die. And so we are not giving all the instances of how these individuals that were the numbered warriors died, but God says his will was against them to destroy them from within the camp until they all perished. And so they continued to die until they were dead. And then we look in continuing looking at this, we get into the demise of. I'm not keeping up with my clicker here. I'm just going to do this, just give you all of them, because I'm not great at keeping up with it. All right, there you go. And you can take a picture of it now, and you have it all up there. So we get into this first generation's dead, and then we get into the demise of Sihon, the king. And this, again, goes back to the end of the book of Numbers, where some of these events were happening. They sent messengers into that land. Verse 25, we see here also, this is the day I began to put dread and fear of you upon the people everywhere. So there was this psychological warfare that God was warring against all these peoples around there as well. It wasn't just their might marching through the wilderness, it was God kind of going ahead of them and sowing the psychological warfare. And so that was happening as well. The sons of Lot took possession. Okay, we're skipping over that a little bit. The Amorites, the Sihon of the Amorite king of Heshbon is who they're going to be fighting against. And so he sends messengers out there. Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass. They were willing to go through his land to pay him for whatever he needed, whatever they used, but he was not willing, in verse 30 of chapter 2. It says, Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land. The Lord our God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate in order to deliver him into our hand this day. I want to pause there for just a second and kind of go over this concept of God hardening his heart. When we read through, this happens with Pharaoh, this happens in other instances, we see this and we say, well, God made that happen. That's not fair. It's not fair to that individual that God made that happen. Let's read a few verses that kind of give us some clarity on this comment. Look over in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, before Pharaoh had this hard heart, Exodus chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. God says, speaking to Moses, "But I know the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go." God knows ahead of time, right? God knows the hearts of men. He knows ahead of time that Pharaoh's going to be a hard-headed individual. Even when Moses is like, "When do you want the frogs gone? Like, we can do it now, whenever it's convenient for you." And Pharaoh's like, tomorrow's good, right? So he was not a normal individual, okay? And in the case with the Sihon, they're saying, hey, we're just going to pass through. It's going to be super chill. We did this with other people, right? We paid our way. This was a way for him to get monies, right? He could have got a lot of money from these people passing through. And he's like, no. You met somebody who's just, no matter what you say, no matter what you do, no matter what benefit it is to them even, they're just going to say no because they want to say no. That's King Sihon. And so God knows ahead of time that this is going to happen. Also, Romans chapter 9 kind of gives us some commentary on this, not this exact event, but with Pharaoh. Romans chapter 9. If you don't look over there, Romans chapter 9, verses 16 through 18. He says, "So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, 'For this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed through the whole earth. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and hardens him who he desires.'" And so we see this with Pharaoh. God knew that he wasn't going to soften. He knew he was going to be obstinate. In this case, God knows that he's going to be obstinate, but he at least allows him an opportunity. In both cases, God allowed them, or gave them the option of a peaceful settlement, right? In both cases, with Pharaoh and with this king, but he knew that they would be obstinate. But the outcome was the glory of God and what God was doing for his people. That was the outcome, right? That was the end result of these things. And so in this case, here are a people who have been wandering around in the desert. They failed to go in and conquer this land before. They've had one battle, kind of skirmish early on with Joshua, Moses raising his hands and that kind of stuff. And now they're about to go in, and they know they're going to go in, they're going to have to conquer these peoples. This new generation has not been battle-tested yet. Would you like a trial run before you try and conquer a nation? Could you see how this might be helpful psychologically to the people, to Joshua, and while Moses is still there, right? Before you leave, right? And so here's a situation where they get that chance. So we're retold about these events that already took place. They conquer this king, and God says, "See, I've begun to deliver Sihon and this land over to you. Begin to occupy that you may possess his land. And so this kind of marks the beginning for them as this new generation comes in and actually gets some field experience in that case. And so they come out arrayed in battle, and the Lord delivered them over to them, and they defeated them. And then in verse 36, from Aor and the edge of the valley of Arnon, and from the city which is the valley, even Gilead, there was no city that was too high for us. The Lord our God delivered all over to us. There was no city that was too high for us. I think that's a shot in the arm. God's prepping them for what they're about to go do. And in one instance, where did I write that note in here? That's the thing about writing all your notes in the margins, is that you skip over. We haven't gotten there yet. But in chapter 3, it talks about this region. They captured all these cities. Chapter 3, verse 4, when they did this conquest. Returned and went up the road Og and Bashan and all his people. The Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I have delivered him also into your hand, and shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of Amorites. So Og was a big guy. We'll talk about Og in a second. But Og was no small man. And so there was already kind of this reputation that he had. And God says, don't fear him. I'm going to give you into him. And so we captured all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob and the kingdom of Og and Bashan. All these cities were fortified with high walls, gates, bars, besides a great many of unwalled towns. So we think, in flannel graph version of this as a child, they come in, they've not had any experience yet, and they go in to conquer this land. But they've already conquered 60 fortified cities before they get into even conquering the promised land. Do you see what I'm saying? So God's really bringing them up, and that's probably part of this psychological warfare here, is this nation, essentially, of people marching through, conquering city after city after city after city after city, and nobody can stand in their way. Do you think if you were just across the river from them, you might know about this, and you might be concerned that they would cross the river? Right? So again, this what God, we see as we read through this, what God is doing. Look over in verse 11 about Og. For only Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. The Rephaim are these large individuals, genetically blessed with height individuals. And so he was last of the remnant, so he was a tall man. The size of his bed in feet was essentially a king-size bed, but 13 and a half feet long. So it was king-size wide, about 6 feet. King-size technically is 6.33333 feet. But anyway, so about 6 feet wide and 13 and a half feet long iron bed or iron bed frame, right? Which isn't a big deal. A lot of us have metal bed frames, but at that time was a big deal. He was a large individual, right? So that's Og. That's the king. And they disposed of him. The psychological concept of here's these people who came from nothing, and they're coming in and they're conquering even Og, who was this grand king, and the people on the other side of the river are probably freaking out right now. And this is all part of it. And this is when he talks about what he divided up for them, beginning of verse 12. And we get this idea of them needing to make sure that they obey. This pact is renewed. Again, remember the pact that was made with the half tribe of Manasseh and Gad and Reuben, that you can have this land, but what? What do they have to do in order to keep the land that they're given? Do you remember? What's the pact that they would made? We're going to go over with our brethren. Like that's what Moses said to them earlier. Shall your brothers go to war while you sit here and do nothing? And they said, no, we'll go with them. We'll go over. So all their men of war have to go over and stay over there and fight until their brethren are at rest, like they are on their side of the river. And so this is again a reminder of that pact that has been made, that they should go over and not fear. Verse 22, do not fear them, for the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. Again, these individuals are being reminded of these events. Not all of them probably who are going to be fighting soon were ones that were necessarily involved in part of this campaign. And so God is continuing to remind them, do not fear, do not fear. I've been with you this whole time. I've held your hand through all of this. Don't fear. And then Moses begins to want to see the promised land. He says he pleaded with the Lord at that time, "O God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness, your strong hand, and for what God is there in heaven, on earth, who can do such works." And he says, let me pray to see the land. Let me cross over. What does God say? No promised land for you, right? No. You don't get to go over. But you can go up on this high place and look over. And go over top of Pisgah and lift your eyes to the west and north, southeast, and see, and you shall not cross over this Jordan. But he tells him, but charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall cross over ahead of his people. And they remained in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. So we see this. Chapter 4, hopefully we can get through this in 5 minutes. Israel, listen to the statutes and judgments I am teaching you to perform, verse 1, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land. See, their obedience to what God has told them is directly tied with their entrance into and their national security. Their obedience to God is a matter of national security. Right? We do a lot of things in the name of national security. Not all great things. But what they're saying, God is saying, your ability to be a nation depends on your obedience to me. And we can fast forward right through their history and say, oh yeah, we see how that plays out. But they're just now starting this. What is he warning them in verse 2 concerning the law? In verse 2, how does he warn them? Don't change it, right? Don't add to it. Do we see this anywhere else? We see it in Revelation. We see it in other places, right? You don't get to change it. Once it's written, this is how it is. This is how it is. And here's again that reminder that several times happens throughout this book. Your eyes have seen what the Lord has done in the case of Baal Peor. For all the men that follow Baal Peor, those that were following after idols, and did that. And so you've seen the treachery. You've seen what men did against God and how he reacted to that. And so again, he says, I've taught you the statutes, verse 5, of what God's commanded to do. So keep them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all peoples. Has that changed? When we keep God's principles and concepts and precepts in our lives and we practice those things, Jesus said, you are salt, you are light. And you are only salt and light when you are doing those things that God has prescribed for us to do. Others will look, not everybody, but in this case, he's saying they're going to see the precepts of God and say that is wise that you're doing those things. Is your wisdom understanding the sight of all peoples. Keep them diligently, verse 9. Again, what your eyes have seen, they do not depart from your heart, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons. Again, there's going to be this continual, especially in chapter 6, this continual idea of make it known to your sons and your grandsons. Verse 10, remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb. What's Horeb? Sinai. Do you think them as children are going to forget that grumbling mountain and the smoke and the fire and God echoing his voice down to them? Do you think as children they're going to forget that? They probably still twitch with anybody something says something really loud, right? So they're going to remember those things. He's saying, do not forget that what happened, that event at Horeb. Let it sear into your minds. Remember those words and teach them. Remember the Lord God and assemble the people, and may let them hear my words and learn to fear me in all the days. You came near and stood. You heard the sound of my words, verse 12, but you saw no form. So God was intentional about this. In this next section, he kind of talks about how he doesn't want any idols of any kind, even of himself, no idols. God was intentional of just giving them his voice and no imagery, no form of who he was, Because what are we good at? We're good at copying things, right? We're good at those kind of concepts. And so he warns them against idolatry here in this case. So watch yourselves and be careful. We'll pick up here. That was the second bell? All right, we'll pick up here next Wednesday. Thank you very much for your time.